Hello and welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty with Scott Tregurtha, where we help critical thinkers by giving you the most true and accurate information we can find, which they should be giving you on mainstream media, but are not. So you can decide for yourself and take control of your liberty, your freedom, and your future. And now, here is Scott Tregurtha.
Welcome, everybody. Today I have a very special guest who is going to give you the other side of the story regarding the war in Ukraine, which you unfortunately are not hearing in the mainstream media or even on your favorite conservative news channel. In this interview, our guest, Mr. Jim Duree, names names you all know very well from our own U.S. government, who were in on the coup d'etat in Ukraine back in 2014, and what led up to the present-day Russian-Ukraine war, and why they want this war and continue to manipulate our populations into the continuation of it. Mr. Duree will also go into the solutions to this and who we must support in order to put an end to this war, prevent World War III, and return our nation back to the sovereignty we worked so hard for in our American Revolution. Mr. Duree is a 45-year political activist for the LaRoche Political Action Committee, and I am very honored to have him enlighten us today. Hello, Jim. Welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty.
Yes, hi, Scott. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here. We want to get to the bottom of what this conflict is with the Ukraine and get what the real story is, because we're not hearing that on mainstream media. We're not even hearing that on our conservative news stations. So why don't we start with, where did this conflict between Russia and the Ukraine actually begin in history?
Well, strictly speaking, it began in the 1920s and 30s with the work of Leon Trotsky and a guy named Alexander Helfand Parvis, who was a top British secret intelligence operative who also worked for the Abwehr, which was that era's version of German intelligence. But the policy behind this whole Ukraine situation is called permanent revolution, permanent war. And this was adopted by the globalist neocons in the US under British provocation by people like Dick Cheney. And today, the big advocates of it are people like Victoria Nuland at the State Department, Cheney protege, and her husband, Robert Kagan, who is the author of the doctrine of color revolutions, so-called. But I don't think people can really understand this adequately unless we bring in one of the key players in the global political and strategic situation right now, and that's President Donald Trump. Back in, I believe it was March, Trump reported one of his Agenda 47 videos called Preventing World War III. And he goes through the situation and what it really means. You see, most people here think we're invulnerable. That is to say, they thought the same thing about World War II before we got bombed. But they think, the war's over there in Europe, the Russians are being attacked, the Ukrainians, blah, 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 but it's not going to come here. But that's not true. What President Trump said is that we have never been closer to World War III than we are today under Joe Biden. In fact, at one point he said people should get down on their knees and pray. That's how dangerous the situation is. But he demands an immediate ceasefire. He says this war would never have occurred if he'd been in the White House instead of Biden, that he could stop the thing right now in one day if he were president, and we have to have full-scale negotiations without preconditions. He says there must be a complete commitment to dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment, which is perpetually dragging us into endless wars pretending to fight for freedom and democracy abroad, while they turn us into a third world country and a third world dictatorship right here in Poland. So what's happened, look, the situation is such, back in the immediate pre-World War II and World War II period, there was a figure known as Stepan Bandera, who was the head of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And these people were a bunch of Jew killing, Russian killing, Polish Catholic killing fascists who set up a branch of Hitler's Waffen SS, and they fought against the Soviets in that whole period. Now, the current crew in Kiev, that is Zelensky's crew, and particularly the people around Zelensky, also the people who carried out the coup d'etat in 2014, they are Bandera supporters. They view this clown as a national hero of Ukraine and as the exemplar of what Ukrainian nationalists should be. Now, we've done whole studies on this stuff. It's very sordid. It's very, very disgusting. But you really have to cut through the bodyguard of lies. And people should learn that term, the bodyguard of lies, in the US and British media, which is designed to prevent people from thinking rationally about this situation. Of course, everybody knows that Putin invaded Ukraine back in February of 2022. However, the truth is that's not what happened. It was Obama and Victoria Nuland and MI6 in the person of Christopher Steele. They invaded Ukraine in late 2013 and orchestrated the overthrow of the legitimate, elected, internationally recognized president of Ukraine, Yanukovych. And it was a violent coup d'etat. So it was not Putin who invaded Ukraine. The purpose of this Ukraine thing has been arranged since the end of the Soviet Union as the crowning achievement of NATO eastward expansion, which is designed to use Ukraine as a military platform for attacking Russia. And I do mean with nuclear weapons. Some of these crazies who are now in control of Ukraine said earlier, we want nuclear weapons to burn Russia. Now, if you go back to this period, just before the end of the Soviet Union, Lyndon LaRouche of our movement had been running for president in 1988. He went to Berlin, West Berlin, gave a big speech at the Kempinski Bristol Hotel there, proposing that the US and other Western nations sponsor the reconstruction of Poland, the economic reconstruction of Poland, which was in rough shape then, as a way of indicating to the soon-to-be formerly communist East Bloc countries what the West could do to create a future for them. Now, within days of that speech, Lyndon LaRouche was indicted by a federal grand jury. He was then put on federal trial and shuffled off to jail, federal prison, for 15 years for crimes he did not commit. And what happened instead of what LaRouche had advocated was that at the end of the Soviet Union, 1991 thereabouts, Gorbachev, the final Soviet premier, he negotiated over the fate of Germany. And there was a deal proposed. The deal was that if the Soviets would agree to the peaceful reunification of Germany, then NATO would never expand to the east. It would never expand 1 inch beyond the eastern borders of what was then East Germany. And it was a complete fraud. It was a complete lie. It was complete perfidy, or as perfide albion, British treachery. That was James Baker the third, who was Secretary of State then for Bush. So what happened then, this process developed in which instead of rebuilding the formerly Soviet states, the Western British Wall Street banking interests went in and raped, pillaged, and destroyed, looted these countries, including Russia itself. And as that process occurred, various people, including from the West, from the US, tried to do something about it before it led to total catastrophe. When Lyndon LaRouche got out of jail in January of 1994, within several months, he was in Moscow meeting with top members of the Russian Duma, the parliament, leading members of the Russian Academy of Sciences and others, on how to reverse the destruction of these countries. Because as you may know, at that point, the immiseration had gotten so bad that people were out on the streets of Moscow in the middle of the winter trying to sell their family silverware for a bottle of milk. It was genocide. And in fact, one of our then collaborators in Russia, Sergei Glasiev, wrote a book with that title, Russia and Genocide, Russia and the New World Order. And we translated that book into English and circulated it rather substantially here. So the point of it is that the situation there was very dangerous. And although Putin came in some years later, around the end of that decade, and rebuilt Russia, that was not done in Ukraine. Ukraine, which was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, had its own aerospace, industrial capabilities, nuclear capabilities, and so on. Ukraine today is the poorest country in Europe, all of Europe. It's quite something. So, and in the same process, NATO has been expanded by, I believe it's 16 or maybe almost 18 different nations, including nations on the border of Russia. And Putin made clear back in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference in Germany, Wehrkunde Conference, big conference, that Russia looked upon expansion of NATO, particularly to Ukraine, as a red line, that it would not be tolerated. And if you look at the map, you can see why that is. Ukraine is right next to Russia. If you put nuclear weapons on the border of Ukraine with Russia, it would not take very long for them to get to Moscow. And this is why it's a red line for the Russians. It's like us. Yeah, well, Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, what we're dealing with is a situation of the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse.
Would I be mistaken by saying that literally all Putin wanted was for NATO and the U.S. to live up to the promise made by James Baker under the Bush administration? Isn't that pretty much all he wanted?
That's correct. Although he would want economic development too, but the point is that rather than sanctions and so on. But yes, it's obvious the Russians or the Soviets then allowed the peaceful reconstruction of Germany. The peaceful reconstruction of Germany. They expected us to hold to our agreement. But you have to understand that the British Empire crowd, and they run the US now. I mean, it's the British geopolitical strategist types. They run the think tanks here. The CIA is kind of a subsidiary of British intelligence. And obviously people like Blinken and Sullivan and the rest of these clowns, they're completely under the control of a British Empire geopolitical perspective.
Okay, when you say British Empire, what exactly do you mean by the British Empire in this day and age?
Good, I'm glad you asked. The answer is the current British Empire is a globalized financial system committed to speculation, usury, slave labor, and the looting of raw materials all over the world. in opposition to the actual American system of mercantilist economics based on science and technology, a national bank, and obviously national sovereignty. We have effectively lost our national sovereignty here in the United States, and President Trump is going to take it back. And that's really the most important fight. The empire, the global empire, what I mentioned when I quoted part of President Trump's statement there about the globalist elites, etc. They have to destroy any significant opposition from nation states. And the number one opposition is the US, Russia, China, and India. They have to destroy them. And the way the British operate, of course, like Rome, is divide and conquer. The British Empire crowd have wanted the US and Russia to fight each other for hundreds of years.
Correct. And of course, the best thing that could ever happen for mankind is for Russia and the US to be very good friends and work together, correct?
That is certainly what has to be fought for, not by our surrendering or them either, but by our recognition of our legitimate mutual interests and our legitimate national interests and basing negotiations where we might conflict on that, not a new world order, not this one world government insanity that these characters have. I'll give you an illustration. The immediate run up to this conflict in Ukraine was a situation where Putin had documented, Putin wrote a 40-page paper, which I read in detail about a year before the conflict erupted, on the common heritage of Russia and Ukraine, in which he went through the fact that there'd never been any conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that the religions were almost identical, the languages were very similar, they were brother Slavs. This goes back, 500 to 1,000 years. But the people who carried out this Ukraine coup d'etat project, that is Biden, Victoria Nuland, Christopher Steele of British intelligence, what they went out to do is to craft an anti-Russian ideology, which of course was used to take over Ukraine. Months before the conflict, the Russians said, we have to negotiate. We can't allow Ukraine to become part of NATO. And they put out their demands, and their demands were three. The first one was, we have to protect the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donetsk Basin, the Donbass. And these are the people who were threatened basically with ethnic cleansing by the Ukrainian Nazis and had been shelled. There had been about 14,000 civilians killed between 2018 and 2023 in these areas. That is, Poroshenko and then Zelensky's armies were on the Minsk Agreement line of contact with their artillery, deliberately launching artillery shells into the civilian areas of these predominantly Russian-speaking Ukrainian towns and cities. Killed 14,000. There's lots of hard evidence of that. But that's the prelude to this.
When you say Nazis, this is what throws a lot of these people off. They're like, Nazis, you're crazy, right? Describe what we mean by Nazis in the Ukraine.
Well, I can do that in great depth. The important thing to understand is that in World War II, as I mentioned earlier, Stepan Bandera set up this Galician division of Hitler's Waffen-SS. These are SS troops, okay? These were made up of Bandera supporters who went off to North Africa and fought alongside Rommel against us. Many of them were transported out of the combat by the British intelligence service into Canada and into parts of the US, where they were embedded within the Ukrainian diaspora, that is the Ukrainian immigrants into Canada. And mind you, these are the Bandera Nazis. They were safe housed there by British intelligence all of this time. Obviously, it's now the question of their grandsons, their granddaughters, and so on. But they were kept alive. The whole movement, the Bandera movement, was kept alive. When Victoria Nuland and the British launched the Maidan in late 2013, preparatory to the coup, they brought many of these people, these Nazis, they were real live World War II Nazis, Bandera supporters, back into Ukraine. Now, there has been a huge campaign to whitewash these folks, to deny that they're really Nazis or that they were really war criminals. But it doesn't really work very well, because if you see what they actually say, including about Russia, about the Jews and others, you look at their wolf's uncle and swastika insignias and all the others of their torchlight parades in Kiev and Lviv and elsewhere. I mean, these people really are Nazis. And I can assure you, I'll give you one illustration about the cover-up. It is claimed that Volodymyr Zelensky, current president of Ukraine, how can you claim he's a Nazi? I mean, he's Jewish. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, there are Nazi Jews like Soros, who's nominally Jewish too. But Zelensky is completely surrounded by these Nazi types. He's completely capitulated to them. And their perspective is to basically exterminate the Russian speakers in the Donetsk basin. And that's why the civil war broke out after the coup d'etat back in 2014. So anyway, the point of it is, they're really Nazis. And it's actually a little bit broader than just Nazis, because Bandera's people had their own Ukrainian fascist ideology. They worked with Hitler. They probably murdered 100,000 Ukrainian, Belarusian, Moldovan Jews, Polish Catholics, Russians in general, and so on, in that period of the pre-war and early World War II period. They're war criminals. And the problem is that British intelligence and the US picked these people up, the pro-British wing of the CIA, after the war, and have kept them going. One study I think I shared with you, which we put out back in May of 2014, quite exhaustive study of who these people are. It's very sordid. The idea that the U.S., I mean, I'll phrase it in a blunt way. In World War II, we backed the Russians against the Nazis, and that was a good thing to do. Now we're backing the Nazis against the Russians. Not a good thing to do.
Exactly. And I wanted to clarify something else for the audience. You mentioned these regions within Ukraine, like the Donbass and Russian-speaking areas. Now, what is Putin's concern with those, regardless of the fact that they speak Russian? What does that have to do with Russia itself?
Well, up until February 24th of 2022, when the special military operation was launched in Ukraine by Putin, the Russian perspective was basically the Minsk agreement, which is the Minsk agreement to which Ukraine agreed, and French and others, the Germans and so on, was that areas like the Donbass, which is in the southeastern corner of Ukraine, east and south of the Dnieper River, that these regions would have autonomy, but they would still be part of Ukraine. And they would have guarantees, they would be allowed to speak Russian, they would not be repressed, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the basic provisions of the so-called Minsk agreement. But as a multitude of people have admitted since then, Ukraine agreed to it but they still carried out the genocide from the contact line that I mentioned. Now, Putin's concern is basically twofold. One, in fact, I'll just tell you the three red lines that Putin and Lavrov and others laid out. One is to protect the people of the Donbass, the Russian speakers, predominantly Russian speakers. The second was that Ukraine had to be denazified. And the third is Ukraine had to be demilitarized, which includes obviously not being part of NATO. Those were the demands that Russia put out very publicly in writing everywhere around the world in the months leading up to February of 2022. Putin's concern is that Ukraine not be allowed to be used as a military platform against Russia, that Ukraine be neutral, maybe something like Austria, which is also neutral. That's a good thing. Now, it's very clear now, if you quote people like this clown Blinken or Sullivan at the National Security Council, their policy is, in fact, to destroy Russia and to inflict what they call a strategic defeat on Russia using Ukraine. They have a small problem, which is that Ukraine has been almost totally destroyed militarily by now. And Ukraine would have negotiated peace with Russia if she were not being propped up by the so-called West and pumped up with weapons. For example, many Americans, because the press here probably think Ukraine is winning the war and Russia's losing the war. But nothing can be further from the truth. Ukraine has already lost, according to the best military sources that we have over here. Ukraine has already lost over 250,000 men killed in action and probably twice that many wounded and out of the situation permanently, to the point that the Ukrainians have to drag 15-year-olds in off the street, give them 2 weeks of training and a Kalashnikov, and sending them off to die in Bakhmut or other such places. I mean, it was announced today by the Russian general staff that Ukraine has lost 26,000 men just since they launched this so-called counteroffensive in the recent period. So, I mean, we're being lied to. In a certain manner of speaking, we're being lied to like we were around Vietnam or around Iraq, except that Iraq and Vietnam are not on the Russian border. It's a very, very dangerous situation.
It really is. And you'd think we would have learned our lesson in Vietnam, because years later, we all look at Vietnam as a war that should have never happened. And we're going to do the same with the Ukraine. But right now, they have the public so manipulated that we, quote unquote, we aren't feeling that way. But we will.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the truth, Scott. As you know, I'm a political organizer for LaRouche PAC, Lyndon LaRouche's Political Action Committee, going way back. Even though I'm not necessarily young enough to go out 7 days a week in the field, I do go out in the field anyway every week. I go out with our card tables and our signs, and we talk to people. And I'll just tell you bluntly, there's no support for this war from the American people. There's just no support for it at all. And I'm sure that Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, Lindsey Graham, and company could care less what the American people think, which is why we have to reelect President Trump, and we have to use better people in the Congress right now to do everything possible to see to it that we don't have a full-blown thermonuclear confrontation with Russia.
Absolutely. And I'm very glad to hear that a majority of the people are not for this war. And also, I totally agree that we've got to get Trump back in there to help reverse things, because this regime, as you've been talking about, like Blinken and Biden and the big players, well, Biden's really just a puppet, but the regime doesn't care what the people really want. They want to accomplish these ends for this British oligarchy, as you've been describing. Now, let's go over to whether people believe this, it's the British or the Bank of England or whatever. We know there's an oligarchy there, or there's a power base that wants these wars and is manipulating our economy. But regarding the Ukraine situation, why does this oligarch want this war?
The answer is relatively simple. The use of Ukraine as a military platform against Russia is part of their global process of attempting to eliminate any opposition to their basically a global fascist program, which could mean the end of humanity, even if it doesn't start a nuclear war. I mean, look, Russia is most Americans at this point don't know much of anything about Russia, but Russia today is a 140 million nation. It's a Christian nation. It's not communist at all, but it's not merely Christian. There's a large Muslim population, a very substantial Jewish population, a Buddhist population, like 55 different nationalities. But Russia is a sovereign nation, and they do have a very well-developed scientific and industrial capability. These idiots who have been claiming over here, oh, the Russians are going to run out of missiles soon and all this other stuff, they've been very surprised that they're not running out of missiles at all. And unlike us, we're now running out of 155 millimeter artillery shells, so we're sending cluster munitions to the Ukrainians, supposedly. That's not happening with Russia. So Russia is a problem for these people because it's a strong sovereign nation. Now, we should be working with them to develop the world. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them on everything at all. But as you may recall, President Trump had a very decent working relationship with Putin of Russia, with Xi of China, and with Modi of India. He was pulling together potentially a strategic entente of the four real superpowers. If those four superpowers work together properly, we can put an end to the global oligarchy.
Okay, so in summary, if they can keep these four powers apart and fighting each other, instead of working together, the oligarch maintains its power. If we're all working together, we're going to have peace on earth, and we're going to be sovereign and our own bosses and live the lives we want to live. And they can't have that. That's what we were fighting for in the American Revolution. And the British just still haven't given up. Is that about right?
Yes, yes. Moreover, it was in our Civil War in the 1860s, which the British backed the South. The British ran the Confederate Secret Service. They armed the South. They funded the South. They built many of their ships. And then they, of course, they assassinated Lincoln. But you see, they decided after that they couldn't whip us militarily anymore. We were too strong. So they shifted to subversion, financial subversion, cultural subversion, economic subversion, and so on. They emphasized taking us over from within. And that's the process which has occurred since then, including the assassinations of our presidents, the coup d'etat against President Trump, and so on. By the way, we should mention that the coup which conducted the overthrow of the legitimate Ukrainian government back in 2014, that is Obama, Victoria Nuland, Christopher Steele, wrote supposedly 50 different memoranda to Victoria Nuland on conducting the coup d'etat there. But this is the same Christopher Steele who wrote the dossier against President Trump. which sparked Russiagate. Same guy. He's not former British intelligence. There is no such thing. He's British intelligence, okay? That's the crew. Same crew. And then, of course, after Russiagate failed in the U.S. Congress with Mueller, then they went with Ukraine Gate, this phone call that President Trump made to Ukraine, which is a very good phone call, in fact, as President Trump pointed out. But that was the pretext for impeachment. But the entire roster of people who marched up to testify against Trump were the people who put the fascists in power in Ukraine. It's Victoria Nuland's crowd. That's who they are. It's really a disgusting situation in that respect. But the point is, Trump is a fighter, and people should rally around him and rally around his Agenda 47. I didn't mention this, but the statement which Trump made regarding the how to stop World War III is just one of several dozen excellent videos produced by President Trump under the term Agenda 47. That is his agenda for the 47th presidency, which is the next presidency. And people can access them. The actual address, if I can find it here in my notes.
Correct. And I have that link on my website in our resources tab, as well as LaRoche-Pak, a link to LaRoche-Pak's site, where they can actually get to Agenda 47 through LaRoche-Pak's site also. We've got it 7 ways to Sunday here, and needs to be, because people need to know about Trump's Agenda 47, because it's basically his platform, really, and what he intends to do. Now, since we got onto the topic of Trump, and it's kind of plain to see that they are out to destroy him. They're out to promote a war between Ukraine and Russia. They want to keep that going, and they want to stop Trump. Now, can you go into what Trump will actually do about all this? It's obvious to me. He's doing exactly what he says he'll do. They're not after him, they're after us, and he's standing in their way. Could you please go into exactly how Trump is standing in their way and is actually threatening to stand in their way even more, which is why they want him out of there?
I can give you a quick sense of that. The point is, Trump has developed a whole series of policies having to do with the strategic situation, the economy, critical issues like drugs and the borders. If you go to that Agenda 47 website, you can listen to them. One of the things that has our political enemies in the swamp, Washington, D.C., the swamp, thoroughly freaked out is that Trump has mapped out how to conduct a systematic clean out of literally tens of thousands of federal bureaucrats at the middle echelon levels, what you call middle echelon policymakers. Of course, he can fire the top ones. That's not a problem. But they've been hiding behind civil service for a long time. And he very explicitly wants to clean out the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and so on. And he's mapped out how to do that. Now, he will get enormous political support from the American people in the process of doing that. I mean, these people will try to counterattack. The point I'm making is, look, we need, in a sense, a peaceful political revolution in this country to recapture what this country was intended to be, and which it has been at various times during our. I know President Trump, for example, looks upon Abraham Lincoln as one of his favorite prior presidents. Looks upon him as a model, and that's a good thing. Yeah, it's a good thing, not a bad thing.
It's a very good thing. And I'm sure the oligarchs would like to handle Trump the same way they did Lincoln. But it would be a bit too obvious at this point, I think. And by the way, let's make the point clear. Yes, Trump is the answer right now. because of what the track record he has, what he has demonstrated that he knows. And he's a fighter for these causes, and he's not coming out with just a bunch of politically entertaining golden nuggets that people are going after. He's not throwing his bones. He is really he's into the fight. Let me put it that way. But going back a little bit, can you go into a little more about what happened in the Ukraine back in 2014 with Nuland and Obama, and even was not Biden involved in that in some way?
Well, obviously Hunter Biden was. No, we publish a lot on this topic. The gist of the matter is that if people know what a so-called color revolution is, it's the new name for CIA regime change, or CIA/British intelligence regime change operations. And what happened is that when it became clear that the president there, when it became clear he was not going to sign an association agreement with the European Union, there was a big debate over that. They thought they would get Ukraine sucked into that, but that he would sign a similar economic arrangement with Russia. That's when the operations by Victoria Nuland and company went into high gear. That was toward the end of 2013. And in fact, it was very quickly after that. Now, the claim is made here that all these protesters in the Maidan were just against dictatorship, this, that, and so on. The truth is, the bulk of them were Bandera supporters. Okay, and free speech and freedom and democracy were not on their agenda at all. Moreover, the actual Nazis were also brought in at that point from Canada and elsewhere. And, with their chains and their helmets and their wolf's angels and so on, or wolf's angel symbols, they turned the Maidan into a bloodbath. After which, the guy's name is Yanukovych, pardon me, Viktor Yanukovych, I believe, was the president. Then you may recall the famous case in which Victoria Nuland was talking to Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in that period. And she said, she laid out who the new government was going to be. She went through with him who we're going to put in as the next government. Yats is going to be prime minister, Yatsenyuk, that is. And it happened that the Ukrainian intelligence recorded that. They picked that up and they broadcast that all over the world, because here is the proconsul for Ukraine, Victoria Nuland, explaining who we're going to put in power. That's called democracy by these people's definition. She named the people. The first one was Yatsenyuk, who became the first prime minister after the coup. And he was a fascist too, tied to the Svoboda party. She called him Yats. That's his nickname, Yats for Yatsenyuk. She went through it more. You can dig that video up. It's disgusting. And then she bragged later. I believe it was in a Senate or House committee meeting. Well, look, we spent $5 billion U.S. taxpayers' dollars, and we got a new government in Ukraine, right? I mean, she's pretty shameless about it. It's kind of like a little Frankenstein's monster. And what's happened since the coup d'etat is that there's been a progressive militarization of Ukraine and Nazification of Ukraine to try to turn Ukraine into this platform against Russia. Now, of course, that didn't go over well in the predominantly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. Well, most people don't realize this. Ukraine has not been a nation. There was no nation of Ukraine until the end of the Soviet Union, when all the different Soviet socialist republics became independent countries. Prior to that, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. Way back there was something called the Ukraine, but it was just an area of people who spoke the Ukrainian language. There was no national Ukrainian identity, contrary to the State Department and their captive anthropologists and historians and so on. Did not exist. But what they've tried to do is to manufacture, well, let me put it this way. It's standard practice for the oligarchy, the Anglo-Dutch Wall Street oligarchy. When they want to destroy places, they go in and they play a game. It's called divide and conquer. Divide et impere in Latin, right? That's the motto of the Roman Empire and the British Empire. In this situation, they had countries which had never been hostile before, and now they're at war, and they start a world war. That's really weird, but that's how these guys work. And we have to take, yeah. And the Trump, if you study Trump's statements, the one I mentioned, but also others, he says we've got to take the country back from the globalist elites who run around the world claiming to promote freedom and democracy while they're really starting endless wars and turning the United States into a third world country and a third world dictatorship. That's very close paraphrase of President Trump, and it's conceptually on the money.
Yes, and I'm glad he speaks that way because it shows he understands what's going on. So, in a nutshell, the oligarchs want to use the Ukraine to actually destroy Russia, really, and keep Russia and the U.S. at odds with each other.
And the U.S.
Right. Oh, and the U.S., right. Destroy Russia and the U.S. and keep Russia and the U.S. at odds with each other and keep Russia, the U.S., China, India, all the great powers of the world at odds with each other. So the oligarchs can just sit back and control us.
More than that, I should have gone into this earlier, but if you study people like Prince Philip, the wife of the husband of the late Queen, and also King Charles now too. The globalists think that we can only support about 1 billion people on the earth, right? That we have climate change going on, that we're doing this, we're doing that. We've got to cut back on the people, right? Now, of course, we have over 7 billion, maybe 8 billion now. What they're proposing is a new globalist world order, which has been completely shattered. The industrial bases have been destroyed, the population is destroyed, dumbed down, illiterate, miserable, and so on. And that you have these regional wars everywhere. And they're willing to tolerate some nuclear wars too. But they're insane. They're Satanists. And we're going to take our country back from them.
And we absolutely have to. It's the only way out. We've got these nut jobs, for lack of a better expression, trying to control everything, and they've been doing a pretty good job, I'd say. They have kept us at odds with each other. They've been eating our culture from within with the transgenderism, the racism that they're saying, the racism that they're using to accuse everybody else of being racist, and so on. So it comes off in layers. I understand it's hard for a majority of the public to truly understand this all in one gulp, but it does come off in layers. And if anybody out there thinks something is wrong, you probably aren't going to figure it all out in a day, but you do need to start researching. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our hour. I think you did the best job that somebody could do in giving some history and what's behind all this. Anything you care to say to summarize or wrap it up?
I would say it simply is that saving the country is not a spectator sport. That people have to educate themselves and go out and organize, not just around these ideas, but around Donald Trump. We've got to put him back in the White House. We've got to cut through the hate propaganda against him, the filthy, bogus indictments. And people have to take that kind of peaceful political action. And we have the capability to win this fight.
You mean the people are going to have to actually do something about it?
Yes, that's the concept.
Okay. Hard pill to swallow sometimes, but people like you and the LaRoche PAC do give us the education and the ability to do it. And there are a lot of good people on this planet doing their best, but we've all got to contribute somehow in some way. On that, thank you so much, Jim, for giving us your time and your expertise. Until next time, have a good week, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you, Jim. So now you have the other side of the story on this very unnecessary and disgusting Ukraine war. And I thank you all for listening to it. Please click on like or subscribe if you got something out of what you heard today. You can also go to my website at takecontrolofyourliberty.com and subscribe to get updates you won't hear anywhere else. Check out more episodes and go to my resources page where you'll find lots of liberty-loving assets, as well as a link to larochepac.com, where you can hear even more truth you won't hear elsewhere from Jim's fellow political activists. And just to summarize, this Ukraine war was manipulated into action by our Western, British, and Wall Street financial system, commonly referred to as the globalists, the oligarchs, the military-industrial complex, but I think the best name for it is the modern British Empire, which, by the way, manipulates and are actually members of our Federal Reserve. Whatever you want to call it, this movement has been trying to keep us down ever since we won our independence in the Revolutionary War. And since then, they manipulated us into the Civil War in 1861, financing the South, and has been key to creating and getting us involved in every war since, including Vietnam and Iraq. And Iraq is a very good example. We got sucked into that one with the lure of weapons of mass destruction. And since then, we learned there were no weapons of mass destruction. And that's just one example. If you research all of our wars, you'll learn there was some lure that was used to manipulate us into them. When will we learn our lesson? Let's end this war now and not wait 20 years to realize how stupid we were for getting involved in this. And let's support our man Trump, who is dead set on no more never-ending wars. And remember, amongst the real invaders of Ukraine were Victoria Nuland, Dick Cheney, Obama, the Bidens, and Christopher Steele of British intelligence, the same Christopher Steele who delivered us the BS Steele dossier to frame Trump in the Russia hoax. These guys manipulated the coup d'etat in Ukraine back in 2014 and fanned the flames and manipulated NATO to extending its borders closer and closer to Russia, breaking previous agreements under James Baker and the Bush Sr. administration. And when Lyndon LaRoche proposed the economic reconstruction of Poland, he was jailed by the same person, Robert Mueller, who tried the same thing on Trump via the Russia hoax. This regime, which includes the above-mentioned players, doesn't want the reconstruction of anything, because that leads to peace and progress. Instead, they push these never-ending wars, anti-progress via the climate change BS, and depopulation via the transgender movement and unlimited abortion. As Mr. Duree stated, saving the country is not a spectator sport. We all need to become educated with real information and not just take in what comes out of the boob tube. And we also have to organize ourselves around Trump and his Agenda 47, which you'll find on my resources page. Also, feel free to email me at scott@takecontrolofyourliberty.com for any questions or ways to help. And remember to take control of your liberty, because nobody else can do that for you.